Our second plenary event this afternoon, and I would like to present to you the moderator of this second plenary event, which is called Perspectives on Exploration. This will be moderated by Mrs. Kathy Laurini, the NASA Senior Advisor on Exploration and Space Operations and past chair of the International Space Exploration Coordination Group. Kathy, please.
Thank you, Christian. So I'd like to welcome you to this panel. It is titled Perspectives on Exploration. And I'd like to thank you, in addition, for attending. We have, I think, a very interesting discussion planned on a number of topical subjects. And I'm joined on stage by a panel of leaders and decision makers that honestly, I think, need no introduction. But as custom dictates that I do so, I'm going to briefly introduce each one of them, and then I will explain to you how I'd like to conduct the panel, and then we'll get started. So first of all, we have Michael Manking. He's the Senior Vice President in charge of Orbital Systems and Space Exploration at Astrium Space Technology, or Space Transportation, sorry, Michael. We have John Shannon. He is the Deputy Associate Administrator for Exploration Planning at NASA within the Human Exploration and Operations Mission Directorate. We have Alexei Krasnov. He is the Director of Piloted Programs, which is all of human spaceflight at Roscosmos. We have John Elbon, who is the Vice President and General Manager for Space Exploration at the Boeing Company. Also, John Karras, who is the Vice President and General Manager for Human Spaceflight at Lockheed Martin. And Pete Worden, who is the Center Director at NASA's Ames Research Center and a visionary and really card-carrying member of the science community. So I'd like to welcome you all for being here, and thank you very much for your participation. I will notice that with this panel here, and half the panel being named John, I think those of you that are thinking of naming your son to destine him most likely for success, John would be a good name, and I did that, by the way, so. Anyway, to the panelists, again, thank you for being here. I'm going to ask you a series of questions, and I'm going to direct a question initially at one of you. And then after, and I'll ask that you provide your opening remarks and try to keep them to within, say, 3 or 4 minutes. Less is okay, but try to keep them to within 3 or 4 minutes. And then we'll open up a discussion amongst other panel members and encourage your perspectives on the topic. I'll try to keep an eye on the clock, such that if we get bogged down in one particular topic, I may try to look for a graceful exit strategy. And if I see that there isn't a lot of response to a particular question that I think the audience might be interested in you guys discussing, I may prod you a little bit. So thanks in advance for your appreciation of that. And to the audience, the topics I've chosen, I think, are timely, and with this particular panel of government representatives, industry leaders, international space participants, human spaceflight, and science, we have a very diverse set of perspectives, and all of them really contributing to the formulations of our policies and plans. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion. And not to mention the fact that each of you are not shy, I think that the discussion should be very interesting. So with that, I promise to leave 10 minutes at the end for questions. I know there were some questions from this morning's plenary that we would like to get to, and there's also the possibility to ask questions of this panel. At moments during the session, you will see the text number flash up on the screen, and I think there's also cards available on the side of the room, so if you prefer to write down your question, that's also possible. So with that, let's get started. So my first question is for you, Alexei. What I would like to talk about is this notion of capability-driven versus destination-driven. Some say that without a focus on a particular destination at this time, a human space exploration effort cannot succeed. And this seems in contrast with the U.S. approach, but also the approach that has led to an extremely successful Russian human spaceflight program, building steadily on your demonstrated capabilities. So can you share your perspective on the opportunities and importance of using existing elements or their derivatives for the achievement of our goals?
Thank you, Cassie. It's a nice question and tough to answer for within the allotted time. But really, first of all, I would like to acknowledge that the destination is certainly interesting for all the scientific and engineering community. However, the scenario which I believe it is most good approach to choose is the scenario which will enable us to go either way, independent of the political, financial, any other drivers which can influence our capability to perform. And the overall approach in the human space flight shall be complemented by the robotics, as it was said during the first plenary session by all participants. And therefore, having in mind that we do have a luxury of ISS on orbit, which is an exceptional capability of the international science community to utilize. And we really question ourselves what we can do about the capacity of ISS until 2020, as we agreed to operate it not less until then, 2020. No other decision is made yet. However, will we be capable of saying to our public, to our science community, that we achieved everything with this capability on orbit? That even having in mind that we are flying to the same destination for the last half a century, have we learned everything about the human being in space? Are we ready to seriously talk about the long duration space flight to other destinations? And it looks like that our physicians and the space medicine and biology specialists are telling us that we are not there yet. We really need to enhance our capability to address many issues. And that's a very small example of the potential utilization of the space station for exploration. There's two parallel things. As the basic science which we are having in mind as a utilization in our minds as a basic science, as a first of all utilization purposes of this unique infrastructure on orbit. However, we do understand that another side of utilization is the utilization of the space station for exploration. It's a technology and capability-driven activity to enhance our capability to plan in real, to have a real planning to implement, to start implementing the missions beyond the beyond low Earth orbit. That's within this small time allotted for today and within this session. I believe that is the interesting approach we shall look into and how to perform further on. Thank you.
Thanks. John Shannon, do you want to add anything to that?
Sure, Kathy. You know, I would just say that you can pick any destination, but you have to build capabilities to get there. And you know, the United States human exploration policy right now is that we will go to an asteroid by 2025, go to the Mars systems by 2030s. But if you think about it, you know, this December will mark 40 years since we sent, any country sent human beings out of low Earth orbit, past the Van Allen belts. We've concentrated on LEO. We understand LEO, I think, very well. We've built an incredible test bed up there to demonstrate technologies. But we don't have those capabilities either for propulsion, for extended ECLS systems to keep crews alive, protecting astronaut crews from radiation, navigation. You don't have GPS out by an asteroid, communications, things like that. We have lost that capability to do those types of things. So no matter what you pick as your destination, when you look at something, okay, let's go to an asteroid by 2025, I look at that and I see a laundry list of things that we have to develop, technologies that we have to reinvent or develop the next generation of in order to be successful to go to any kind of a destination. So when we talk about destinations, we have a fairly clear policy as to where we want to go. However, we have a very difficult time in front of us building those capabilities to get to those destinations. And I would say that the last time we did it, the world was a very different place. We did not have the partnership that we have for ISS that we can build upon now, and the budget situation was very different. Now, because of limited budgets in all the space programs, we have to work together. Luckily, we have the partnership that's been developed through the ISS that we can capitalize upon to start building those capabilities together.
Thank you. Okay, my next question has to do with the cost of human spaceflight. And so, John Karras, I'm going to ask you to go first on this one. When failure is not an option, programs can get very expensive in our business. So Lockheed Martin, I think, and NASA's Orion program have done a really great job, a lot of work to streamline processes, reduce costs. Yet government budgets do seem flat in the near term. So the question to you is, can we really deliver the kind of missions outlined in the GER, the Global Exploration Roadmap? You know, are there things that we can continue to do, that we can do additionally to lower the cost of acquiring these space systems?
Sure. Thank you, Kathy. Kind of in two parts. Over the last few years on Orion, we've worked really hard with NASA headquarters and our partners at JSC about reducing costs, and we have gotten more streamlined, and we're using more industry standards, and we're getting more value for the NASA work and more collaborative help and oversight, and I think that's working well, and I think we can do better and more. However, when you're targeting for a deep space spacecraft, safe havens at the ISS or abort modes to LEO or to the ground are a little harder, so there's got to be a balance when we go exploration. But I think there's ways of reducing costs of deep space exploration spacecraft. But to answer your second question, do I think we can do some missions outlined in the GER or the Global Exploration Roadmap? And my answer is yes, even in the flat budgets. And so let me paint you a picture that I think that can be done. But the first thing you have to realize is that you have to do it more austere. You can't think ISS, you have to think, Space Hab, so to speak, or Space Lab, and or Skylab. And you have to create a program that's affordable, right? So if you think about what this global community has done in the last 30 years, right? The United States has launched, on average, 4.5 shuttles a year for 30 years, right? The global community, and every shuttle had a unique payload in it, or an element. Also, during the last 20 years, we've heard people talk about that the nations, spacefaring nations, have supplied elements in the shuttle program that the shuttle lifted that also designed, produced, and outfitted a space station in low Earth orbit. And I would say that those budgets are commensurate with the budgets that we have today, probably a little more, a little less in some cases. But if you think about a shuttle launch is at least equivalent to an SLS launch. And SLSs should be cheaper, and therefore you should be able to get more launches per year. And if you think about the elements that we all produced, they were in the tens of different kind of elements that if you look at a Mars moon mission, right, and it's on the roadmap on the way to Mars, and Mars moons are easier too because it's cheaper than landing on the surface, and you can do it without nuclear power and without very large infrastructures. You could probably do a mission like that for about 6 or 7 heavy SLS vehicles. Okay? And some of the studies we've done, you need a few more elements than an SLS and an Orion to do that with. Far less the number of elements we produced in the 30 years flying in the shuttle, or even the module we all developed and flew for station. So if you do that simple math, 4.5 launches a year, all the new elements you need, divide by 6 launches. Given that math, you should be able to go to Mars once every other year. Kind of funny, but that's kind of the math. So you say, well, let's see, our budgets are going down. Perhaps we could go to Mars once every 10 years, perhaps, with that kind of arithmetic. So I really think if you have the leadership and the dedication to go do it with the right austere program, and you design an exploration program with the budgets we have, I think the answer is yes. You can achieve the end goal of going to Mars before 2030. That's in the global exploration roadmaps. So I think that, you know, it's just important that we work together and we apply our resources to set missions. And oh, by the way, all of a sudden, near-Earth object missions, you know, within that context make more sense than by themselves. And you can essentially test the propulsion modules that John Shannon talked about, and the HAB modules, and the other technologies you need in cislunar space closer to the Earth to develop those modules in a step fashion that is more affordable than, I don't want everybody out going saying, John says you can go to Mars by 2030 with a flat budget, but the point is, there are elements we can do and technologies we can develop today in cislunar space that can make that achievable in the future if we work together.
Thanks. I mean, Michael, you guys have a ministerial coming up and some budget pressures also in Europe. What are your thoughts on the topic?
Let's say first, I think it's very important also to take the lessons learned, let's say, of the ISS. And perhaps starting with one of the key messages, competition is key. And it's really, let's say, key for us, let's say, for the tools, for the processes, but for sure also, we should not forget it, for our teams. It means for the brain, for the teams, at the end, to find the most efficient way. A second point is, let's say, on both sides, on politics, agency side, as well as on the industrial side, to work with commitments. Just to remember, I think we started the development of Columbus, and we signed it in 1996 under firm fixed price conditions. And for sure, commitments are more than just, let's say, firm fixed price, but it shows the way and the tendency, I think, which is necessary to be reliable on both sides. The other point, for sure, and we made special experience in Europe, is the industrialization. ESA uses Astrium to industrialize the operations of the European contributions to the space station, also in a kind of firm fixed price program with some, for sure, flexibility for operations. But this shows also that this is possible and that the so-called exploitation contract is key. And I think it's not a secret that Alexei mentioned that up to 2020, this is the current way which we see for the ISS, at least until 2020, that we will also take over, and this was signed in agreement, a significant part of cost reduction on operations. One of the main subjects, and I think this was also mentioned by you, John, is for sure the reduction and mitigation of risk. So therefore, when we are talking and working in, let's say, international cooperation, the standardization of equipment, of system, and so on is key. I think we have done something for sure for the ISS, but I'm pretty sure that we can do much more with respect for sure to the standardization, which will help us for development, but for sure also at the later stage for production as well as for operations. And last not least, which is very important, is at the end the maturity of the technology programs which are necessary for the development. That means really to ensure that there is a sufficient level of technical readiness level or of integration readiness level. Thank you.
Thanks. I mean, John brought up the idea of a flight every year and a half or a flight every 10 years. I mean, I think we can all agree that we're striving for a sustainable human spaceflight endeavor. Have you guys, any of you thought about what is the flight rate that corresponds to a sustainable program?
It's depending what we are looking for. So let's be practical and foreseeing what we need, what we would like to achieve. Having in mind that the asteroid or Martian mission can take time and resources, I believe we will end up complement this activity with the activity which is going on today in a different format. For some reason, I believe that there won't be, after ISS, there won't be any replica of ISS of that scale. But there's still a question which is being asked for, is there a role of LEO for our perception, along with exploration aspirations? What we will expect from LEO as a human beings for whether we will fly the destination in some form and complement with the exploration activity. And that's, for some reason, I believe that we will end up in the combination of many things, especially having in mind that we have a huge industrial capacity which was built upon today. And if we will limit the flight rate to our one flight per year and a half or 10 years, what we will have is this capacity. It cannot exist in a vacuum. Therefore, it will be a combination of pragmatism and resources which will be allotted by our governments to perform the space programs, huge missions. I'm talking about the lunar, Martian, asteroid, or Lagrange point of missions.
Thanks. Okay, my next question is for you, John Elbon. And I want to talk for a little bit about delivering benefits to stakeholders. You know, much is said these days regarding the importance of our investments in space exploration, really delivering benefits to people on Earth. What is your opinion on this? And is it merely a communications issue, or can we do more to deliver benefits?
So I would say it's some of both, Kathy. Just a few examples to kind of talk about the communications part first. So I would speculate that if you ran into somebody in the street or the person next to you on the airplane and you said, would it be worth it if we spent a couple $2 billion to put a GPS constellation on orbit, they would say no. But if you asked them if they're willing to give up the Google Maps on their iPhone or the TomTom in their car, they would say, oh, you can't take that away from me, I absolutely need it. So that the connection isn't made. Or, you know, another one might be if you ask somebody, should we spend the money to put another weather satellite in orbit? They would say, why should we do that? We have the Weather Channel. You know, so the connection isn't always there. Another interesting question to ask people is what percentage of the national budget that they would guess we spend on space and space exploration. And you usually get answers like, you know, 5, 10, 15%, rather than less than half of 1%. So there's clearly a communications thing that needs to happen. Here's just a few things that have come out of station, and I would ask each of you to listen to these and see if you know about them, because I'm not sure those of us that are in this stuff every day take the time to learn. So, you know, we've found or developed microcapsules that provide a better system for delivering chemotherapy, so tiny, small spheres. Technology from the robotic arm has been used to develop surgical robots. We grow more perfect protein crystals, and out of that, a treatment has been developed for muscular dystrophy. Ultrasound is used as a diagnostic tool, and that's enabled that same capability to be used in remote areas so that we can communicate with hospitals and give people care. And water purification is used for disaster relief. So those are, you know, kind of the 5 that I pulled out. They're often the ones to talk about, but I would wonder how many of us in this room are that familiar with those. So I think it's real important for all of us to learn in layman's terms the good things that are coming out of space and be able to communicate that as individuals and as a government and industry team, so that the public can understand more about the good that comes out of space. In addition, we need to do a better job, I think, of making it easier to do research in space. I'm hopeful that CASIS will be an avenue to cause that to happen for space station. So I think there's some of both.
Okay, thanks. Pete, I'm curious of your perspective. You know, science missions have decadal surveys. They're a foundation of one of their main stakeholder community. Human spaceflight has multiple stakeholder communities. What advice do you have for the human spaceflight community in making sure they deliver benefits to the stakeholders?
Well, I think that we're coming to a realization that a decadal survey, you know, something done once a decade, is probably not frequent enough. That they're based on sometimes unrealistic assumptions of budgets, but they're also just one community's input. And it's really essential to understand that, you know, science is really important. I'm a scientist, I love science, but it is just one piece of what we do in space. You know, and I like to look at this a little broader, and my favorite science, and I have to confess at one time being an opponent of this, but I'm a zealot now, so is astrobiology. And I think astrobiology represents really where human spaceflight and science come together, and where the public is really interested. You know, I guess astrobiology has three pieces. First is how life began, and that's really important for us to know. The second one, though, really begins to touch on human exploration and eventually settlement on other worlds, and that's where else is there life in the universe? You know, we've said our ultimate goal is Mars. There is tantalizing evidence that there is life on Mars. I have to say most of the positive evidence came from Goddard, so it might be wrong.
Others say JPL.
Yeah, actually, I think it's right. But this is an interesting question. You know, if we're going to send people eventually to stay on Mars, you know, this is kind of a bipartisan issue. If there's life on Mars, if you're a liberal, you're worried about us killing it. And if you're a conservative, you're worrying about it killing us. So, you know, this is a science question, is where else is there life in the universe, that is absolutely essential and has to be linked to our human exploration program. And the final part of astrobiology is what is the future of life in the universe. And I think that that's an unambiguous question. We are its future. We only know there's one place that life definitely exists. And sometime this century, we are going to expand our life, or things derived from our life, into the solar system and maybe beyond. So these are inextricably linked, and I'm seeing for the first time in my agency and in other agencies as well, is a discussion of the science has to go hand in hand with those doing human exploration, and hand in hand, maybe hand in claw with the technology as we develop robotics. So it's really going to be an exciting future, and we're seeing that come together.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great lead into my next question, this synergy between human spaceflight and science. You know, one of our objectives in planning this conference, the program committee, was to strengthen the growing synergies between these two communities, the robotic science community and the human exploration community, building a better understanding of opportunities that come to each by increasing these synergies. So Pete, so John Shannon, let me ask you first. John, what is your perspective on the return to each community in taking steps to strengthen these synergies?
Sure. I got assigned to the Mars Program Planning Group, which has been looking at near-term options for Mars exploration, and it's that group comes out of the Science Mission Directorate, but they have been extremely active, much more so than I've ever seen in my time at NASA, at including the human exploration side in their deliberations and their discussions, and really wanting to know, working it both ways. One is, I keep getting asked the question, what do you need to know in order to execute human exploration of Mars? Things like thickness of atmosphere, constituents, dust, radiation, all those different types of things. And then they actively try to find solutions to develop that knowledge that may not really help the Science Mission Director, but it would be indispensable for the human side. The other way it goes is we are able to help them in things like a sample return mission. And we discuss if we had a human capability in the 2030s to orbit in the Mars system, would that be of benefit to a sample return mission? The answer was, of course it would. And then we discussed different ways that we could save money and we could execute a mission like that together with the science team. And I see it just going back and forth as we talk about building capabilities, as we talk about things like John Karras talked about in cislunar, as we talk about asteroids. I think there's much more communication between the two organizations because we realize that the budgets are so tight. Going it alone is really much more difficult. If you can partner with other missions, maybe unmanned missions that are specific for science, but you get information you can use on the human side. And the same way, if you're doing human missions to develop eclipse or propulsion, we'll put a science payload on there as well. And work together and develop that. And I've seen that sense of teamwork that has been developing over the last last couple of years, and it's pretty exciting.
So, Pete, what can you say from the science side? I mean, how do you allay the fears of both sides that you're not just coming after the other guy's money?
Well, I mean, unfortunately, lots of things, get down to money, but we have to remember that all the money NASA spends is taxpayers' money. So it's not our money; it's your money. But the important thing here, I think, is technology. That's really the glue that puts the two together. And I'm really delighted to see that NASA and I think our partners in other agencies are putting more and more money into technology, because one of the interesting things to me is that we can do surgery at intercontinental distances, but it's not a robot that does the surgery. It's a robot controlled by a human mind. And the technology to increasingly integrate us with machines is exactly what we need to get not just exploration and I think eventually settlement of the solar system, but to get the science we need out of it. It's probably going to be too expensive to have the first mission or even the few missions to the vicinity of Mars land on the surface, but having an astronaut virtually present in the machines that we got going into caves and looking for life and doing other things, I think is really the synergy that is going to make this possible. The same thing for asteroids is that to really explore these objects, you need machines to go places we can't go, but we go with them. And so I guess it really is developing that capability to go, I'll call it hand in claw with the robot.
John Karras, did you have a perspective?
Sure. I think what Pete and John have said is absolutely true, and we're looking for other ways to join science. And so the telerobotics aspect of it, if you're in the vicinity, the light times to the surface of Mars is really short, and the bandwidth increases exponentially. And so there's a lot of science you can do. And if you talk about that in the context of vicinity of Mars, Mars moons, and how that could work, then in cislunar space you could practice that also in lunar orbit. But there's other science that you can do in a cislunar space. I know I like to talk about Mars, and maybe that's a step too far, but all the analogies work backwards into cislunar space, likewise with the technologies. So there is science as well as you can do on the far side. You can do radio astronomy that you can't do anywhere else in the solar system, because you're actually protected from the Earth. And then there's second bombardment aspects of the far side that are unique there. So there's a lot of different science things that I think if humans are there to explore and increase the boundary of our technologies for whether it's radiation or eclipse or whatever, that there's other science things you can do. And then lastly, John Shannon has been working on missions where EM1, our first exploration mission on the first SLS with an Orion going around the moon in 2017, we should have some spare capacity to bring along a science mission, I'll say relatively for free, because there's a ride there, and you can slingshot by the moon into the inner or outer solar system if you want. So those are opportunities that I think that we're starting to work together and make the connecting participles, the dangling participles, putting those things together that allow us to go have a stronger exploration program. And I mean exploration in the sense of robotics and humans.
Yeah, very good. Anyone else? Okay, let's talk for a second about the role of governments. So looking back at successful exploration endeavors in history, governments and private industry have each played a role. If we look forward, what is your perspective on the role of government versus private industry as we explore the solar system? And Pete, why don't you start it out?
This is an opportunity to get in trouble, I suspect. But
SpaceX had a beautiful launch this morning.
That's a good answer. I think there's significant synergies here between the private sector and the public sector. The public does, governments do things that don't have any immediate return. So I would say first and foremost is technology development. In fact, NASA's roots were in the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics, and their role was to develop the technology that enabled an industry. Second, of course, is the exploration. Governments do preliminary exploration missions. The missions that we're going to do to asteroids, to the vicinity of Mars. Those are the exploration missions. Those are the similar to the great government exploration missions in the centuries past. And the third thing we've mentioned is science. I mentioned that, again, to repeat, I think life sciences is one of the things that is going to become a really major area, is to understand how life works and how can it work in space. This having been said, it's sort of interesting to me that we may be returning to an era prior to World War II where a lot of science is going to get done by the private sector. I'm really intrigued that there is a proposal that's being worked to find funding to go do an asteroid survey. And these will be the same survey that will tell us where, which are the right asteroids to go visit. There's another private initiative to go to asteroids to mine them. A very exciting possibility. And lastly, I think, ultimately, and this may be a uniquely American perspective, but it is the private sector or private groups that settle other places. And so we talk about settlement of the solar system as something that may happen this century. I think it will happen this century. I suspect that will be largely driven by the private sector based on the work we as a government do to enable it. And so our job as a government is to enable that expansion into the solar system, enable the acquisition of new knowledge.
Okay, John Elbon, how about your perspective?
So I think it's important to think of the relationship between government and industry as varying along a spectrum. And so one end of the spectrum might be defined as transportation to low Earth orbit, something that we've been doing for 50 years. The technology that's required is understood. And there's some potential for a commercial market there. And the other end of the spectrum might be exploration to Mars or into deep space, where the technology required isn't as well understood. The degree of difficulty is more challenging, there's more unknowns, and there's less of a definition of what kind of a commercial market might be there. And so if you look at that spectrum, on the one end, it's much more primed for industry to have a more of a leading role and government to have less of a role, and then the other end of the spectrum, that would kind of be reversed. The extent of business risk that industry can take is different one end of the spectrum than the other end of the spectrum. So, I think the path forward that's been laid out for more of a commercial, as it's been coined, approach for transportation to low Earth orbit, and then more traditional kind of relationships between government and industry for the programs that we're doing like Orion or SLS is the right kind of blend and mix for that. I think in both models or along that spectrum, I would suggest that we really need to work on making the process more efficient. And one thing I would offer is that a place to focus in doing that is to focus on the velocity that we make decisions and I call it the stickiness of those decisions, but how often we revisit those. So in either model, we can be more efficient by focusing on that, I think. So anyway, there's a few thoughts on that topic.
Do you guys, and this is open to any of you, do you see a difference in the opportunity for commercial activity based on the two destinations in the GER, asteroid next or moon next? Is there a difference in opportunities?
Nothing really pops to my mind, Kathy, about what a difference in the opportunity. I think there's a lot of unknowns about what commercial opportunities might be at either of those destinations. And frankly, even in LEO, there is, in my view, there's unknowns about what the commercial opportunities might be. But there's more, you can better define them, I think, in low Earth orbit.
How about for you, Alexei? Do you have an opinion on this question that Pete touched on, but private industry settling a destination? And I presume that probably assumes the availability of local resources. What's your thoughts on, do the governments have a responsibility to basically demonstrate that their availability, the resource availability? Any responsibility on the government side that you see?
I will agree on the judgment that the role of the government, first of all, is to enable private industry to find new avenues in the return on investment projects in space. We can name few today, like communication, remote sensing, which is working in a very understandable manner. But even the space tourism, which just recently emerged, and has a good potential as well. It's a new avenue which we have not thought maybe 20 years ago about such a development in such a scale. And I'm sure that that was a role of the government for using the example of the space tourism and the Mir NASA project, then ISS. We explored that, and we came to the conclusion that we can open this avenue for private industry to further on, to develop on their own, and get their return on investment eventually. And I believe there will be other examples as well. There could be very applied things, like the examples we just heard from Mr. Elban, and the very useful examples of utilization for which for ISS helped us to achieve. We are not achieved the capacity to have a semi-industrial production on orbit of things which could be useful on Earth in a biotechnology area, for example, or new materials. We had thoughts for 20 years ago about the microgravity uniqueness and the best environment in microgravity to be achieved in order to have this great results in the material research. And we are not there yet, and it could be the avenues of the development of human space flight as a man-tended capability on LEO, for example. That could be a successor of the present prominent space flight on the low Earth orbit. Could be. And that depends on the industry initiative, what scope of the practical, interesting ideas we will get to have a load or payload for the, for example, as I said, for the free flyer. Will it be a good set of such for experiments and the hardware available there? And we are ready to discuss it within the partnership to have this project going on. And it could open the avenue for the private initiative as well.
Thanks. Okay, now I'd like to discuss the subject that was brought up this morning. I think Jean-Jacques Dordain touched on it first, but this idea of cooperation versus competition. So Michael, I'd like your perspective on this. The way Jean-Jacques presented it, cooperation is essential in implementing large infrastructure in space, yet there's always a role for competition in whether it's services or components. So what are your thoughts on the topic?
I think I can only confirm what Jean-Jacques mentioned today. I think first coming to competition, and I've already mentioned it, let's say for industry it's key, because it's key really to be in a competition for the best idea, to be also in competition for breakthrough technologies, and at the end to realize, to deliver whatever is necessary for space, the products, in the most efficient way. And at the end, as already mentioned, it's a question of sharpening ourselves, our tools, our processes, but not to forget, and this is for me the main focus, our teams. If our teams are not in competition, they are not forced, let's say, to be at the front line. So therefore, that is really essential for us. Coming back to cooperation, I think especially perhaps for Europe, cooperation was always the key, let's say, to attend, to participate to huge space projects. So therefore, it's, let's say, for me, cooperation, international cooperation is the only way at the end to take over the challenge of, let's say, of these huge space challenges. And perhaps also looking a little bit back to ourselves, I think Astrum has a long-term heritage in first, let's say, in competition and cooperation, because when we are looking back to Spacelab, let's say Spacelab was won in Europe in competition to other companies, but for sure was for Europe also the baseline for cooperation. And at the end, this was, let's say, the first cornerstone which leads us today to ISS, and let's say we are looking to the future for exploration.
You know, you brought up the topic of cooperation. I think we all recognize that that we're going to need each other to implement the kind of missions that we're talking about today. I mean, that drives a level of interdependency that we haven't seen before. I mean, we're going to need each other to accomplish the missions. It implies that we ought to consider, deepening our level of interdependency, in my mind, in terms of developing some of these systems together. What are you as afraid of this? Are you welcoming this? Give me your thoughts on this sort of interdependent future where, say, John Karras needs Michael Manking, and those relationships are going to be essential to our mutual success. So, John, why don't you go first?
Sure. So in the economic reality, in the human spaceflight exploration budget, right, assuming it's flat, we can go develop an SLS and Orion, and then as we ramp down developing those, we're going to go operate them, right? So in order to go anywhere in deep space, there's other elements, as John mentioned. There's habitation that we need better ECLS on, and there's other propulsion elements that we need to go farther and deeper into space on, and those elements in the near term, if you want to go explore the next 10 years, you have to start essentially today. And if our budgets are flat in the United States, then that other budgetary aspects to build other elements, and I'll just say a propulsion module and a HAB, for example, have to come from our international partners. So I would love to have an element from Michael and an element from Alexei, and us and John, the Johns here, will go provide the boost and the people to get there. And so I think that's just the economic reality of it. And I think we have to start earlier than later, and we have to understand what elements we need. And I think we've talked about a couple of them here that are pretty apparent that can enable a whole capability of missions in cislunar space, and eventually provide enough technology base for a transit to a NEO or to Mars in the terms of 6 to 8 months. So I think it's essential. And from that standpoint, cooperation is the foundation. It's no longer a nicety to have. It is the foundation of human exploration beyond LEO. And I think if we don't seize the opportunity now, we'll be locked in low Earth orbit for another generation or so. So I think it's really important, and it's obvious that we all have strengths and derived from ISS and the shuttle, and ATVs and HTVs and Soyuzes and Progresses, and that we have capabilities to go do this. So I think it's absolutely essential, and as I said in my opening remarks this morning, I think starting to build additional consensus on that will allow us to explore.
Yeah. We all have capabilities. We all have good relationships. Alexei?
Yeah, I believe that just to complement what was said, I believe that it's obvious that national space programs will exist in spite of the rationale and that the huge missions which we are talking about for asteroids and Mars will be international, of course, and that's the it's like two things in one: international cooperation and competition. Because nationally we will be looking at each other and compete in a certain extent, and internationally we will be gathering and concurring on the destination and the purposes we are putting in front of us, goals to be achieved. And that's a synergy of two approaches in one perspective.
Yeah. Good. Okay, any final thoughts? I've got some questions from the audience. John, go ahead.
I just had an analogy I wanted to share. So both are important, competition and cooperation. And I can't take credit for this analogy. I got it from a high-ranking. Gerst can take credit for it someday if he wants to. It's like two brothers fighting, and it's the competition is important, but they need to be fighting in the basement, not in the living room, so that the cooperation is happening also.
Well put. That's funny. Okay, thanks. Okay, so let's take some questions from the audience, if I if I may. Okay, so the first one, is it necessary to end the ISS program before exploration missions beyond LEO can begin? John? Shannon, or you're John Oban?
Boy, I hope not, because we're relying on the ISS as a technical test bed to be able to demonstrate a number of technologies that are going to be required, and to say that, boy, we have to stop ISS before exploration is just, in my mind, making a monumental mistake, because as you develop these capabilities, you don't want to have a full SLS launch and commit people to a riskier mission when you can prove that technology in ISS. We've spent a great deal of time in the exploration world looking at the technologies that need to be developed, and we really bucket them in 3 different areas. Things that we can do on the ground and test on the ground, things that we can do in LEO and test at ISS over long durations, and then things that you can only do in an exploration framework. And those exploration ones are fairly small, but the ISS is fairly large. Now, I think the reason the question was asked, right, is because ISS is a fairly expensive piece of the overall United States human exploration budget, right? That's why that anybody that wants to do exploration needs to be an enormous fan of what happened last night, and this is why I think the shuttle was ultimately canceled. It was because the shuttle had built ISS, outfitted ISS, done the last Hubble servicing missions, those things unique to shuttle that could be done, but it was very expensive, and people realized if we're going to keep ISS up there, we can do it cheaper than we can do it with the shuttle, and we're demonstrating that now. If you want, I don't think NASA's going to get a bigger top-line budget. Matter of fact, I'm pretty sure of that, at least in the near term. If you want to have exploration, if you, like I do, if you want to get our flight rate above 0, right, and go do exploration, we have to reduce costs of some of the other things that we do. And one of those things is supplying and outfitting and utilizing ISS. So we have to make sure that the commercial piece is very successful, because if it is successful, then that will enable the dollars to come into exploration so that we can get off the dime and get going here.
Thanks. John, Alvin?
Yeah, so I agree with all that John said and foot-stomped at. I'll add one thing. I think it would add tremendous risk to the continuance of human spaceflight if we had a gap like that. In this country, we're taking a risk right now with a gap in the ability to put humans in space, and I think we'll get through that. But if we ended the station program before we were ready to begin the next program, I think we would have a real challenge keeping momentum and keeping human spaceflight going in general.
Michael?
I think for me, the ISS is perhaps much more, let's say, the first stepping stone for exploration, because what you have already mentioned. First, I think from the technology point of view, it's a test bed which we need. I think we learned a lot, but for sure there is also a lot which we will do in the next years, let's say, to prepare ourselves from the technology point of view for exploration. But I think in addition we have also to consider other facts. One aspect is, for example, operations. And the ISS can be used also for the preparation of operation, let's say, of space exploration, which is key. And let's say what you mentioned, Alexei, also the kind of international partnership. I think we learned a lot out of the ISS, and I'm absolutely convinced that this will also help us for the future missions into space.
That's very good, thank you. Okay, the next question is talks about space debris. So the question is, until some significant solution to address the challenges of space debris can be developed and agreed upon, how much resource should be expended into space exploration given current economic restraints? So are you guys worried about space debris? Is it something that we ought to wait for a solution on? Pete?
Well, you know, space debris is like a lot of other problems that are caused by human activities. It is a problem. It's one we have to be concerned with. But I'm convinced that there are some interesting solutions on the horizon. I won't get into details. I know some people at my center, and I've talked to people in industry, have solutions. I mean, one of the interesting numbers that I understand is that if you removed a handful of large satellites, you know, a couple a year, that would stop the growth of space debris. I think the other measures we're taking that all countries are agreeing to, of minimizing debris and being able to deorbit things, is also helping. So it's a problem, I think, that's solvable. But I think it's essential to separate this problem from the other things we do in space. Space debris certainly doesn't have a lot of influence on missions to asteroids or Mars or cislunar space. It's kind of like saying that it's snowing in North Dakota. I don't think I'm going to go to California from Washington this year. It's like, it's kind of a different problem. So we really need to separate the two. But I am optimistic that we have some solutions to the space debris problem on the horizon.
Okay. Anyone else? Okay, this is for, I guess, all of you with the human exploration program experience, Michael, John Karras. So the subject is risk and safety. Assuming that we all can agree that in exploration missions we do want to keep the astronauts alive, why do some people say that it's too expensive to do this the way NASA does business? Is it a risk discussion? Do we need to accept more risk? Do we need to talk about that side of the equation as we go forward into the solar system? So, how about John Elbon, you first?
Which?
John Elbon and John Tierney.
So, I don't. The question is tough. It makes some assumptions that I don't necessarily agree with, and we can't compromise safety. That doesn't mean that we can't do things more affordably. The two aren't mutually exclusive. There's other variables that we can work on, like requirements, like I mentioned the processes that we use for decision making and expediting that. So I just don't agree with the premise that increased safety equals increased cost. In fact, simpler systems that are more affordable are more reliable and more safe sometimes. So I guess that's the comments I would have about that.
John?
Yeah, I've thought a lot about this. It's going to be different. With shuttle, with ISS, you're 2 hours from Earth. The problem that we have, and that I see at least at NASA, is a cultural problem. It is because I do not think that we could just get in a rocket and go to an asteroid today. Not from a technology standpoint or an operational concept standpoint, but I think the cultural piece of it is enormous because we're not used to that. We haven't dealt with that. We haven't built our processes, our thought discussions on risk. Where if you go and you have some kind of a problem that you're 9 days from home or you're 9 days from being able to execute an abort to start bringing you back home. And so the way to combat that is that you have an evolutionary buildup. You start doing missions that have clear abort regions, that you start to gain confidence in your ecosystems and your propulsion systems and your radiation protection systems and all the things we've already been talking about. But you also build up your cultural tolerance to be able to understand what that risk is, and it'll be a very different risk model from the LEO risk model, and that is completely based on the fact that it is longer periods of time before you can get back to Earth's surface, and that is a function of of just what you are going to do and the trajectories. The way to mitigate it is that you test and you build up and you have an evolutionary approach. But we're not there yet. And as a team, as a partnership, we are going to have to, that's one more thing that you have to build up in this exploration discussion. That's the culture piece, being able to commit crews to long periods of time when they don't have a quick abort back to Earth. And that's just part of the discussion that we're going to have.
Anyone else? Okay, this brings us to the end of our scheduled time, so I'd like to take the opportunity to thank you panelists very much for the insights that you've provided us today with your perspectives. And let me say one last thing. There were a number of questions that we didn't get answered, and so thank you. I'm sorry. Thank you for the questions. I'm sorry we didn't. And as is now custom at this conference, I will pass them on to the moderator of the next panel.
Thanks, Kathy. I think we will end up with a whole load of questions at the end of the conference. Well, thank you, panelists and ladies and gentlemen. We are now having our second networking coffee break in the solarium, which is again sponsored by Battelle Memorial Institute. The technical sessions will convene at 3:30. And once again, the reminder that we will be pleased to see you back in this room tonight for the welcome reception and the poster session. And this will be also at 6:30 this evening. Thank you.